Hello everybody, this is going to be prompted by a very brief comment exchange that I had on a anarcho-capitalist YouTube video that was put out by somebody who purports to have been a former anarcho-capitalist. Although watching the video it becomes very difficult to uh, imagine how much this person could have known given the kind of sloppiness of the arguments, but um, I'm always struck, when I'm debating people, and especially utopian socialists, and there's more than one vein of these, they don't all believe in exactly the same thing, but I'm always struck whenever they outline their basic kind of model of how they want the world to work, how they say it should work. And I don't expect people to have perfect plans down to the most finite minutial detail about everything in society. I don't expect that. Um, but that said, if you have a certain type of society that's going to be organized in a certain way, predicated on a certain type of organization, that implies that is going to imply certain issues. It's going to imply certain technical eventualities, and if those are certain, right? Um, if you're going to say, for instance, very generically, we're going to have a society that's based on voting. You have to have a way then that's implied that you have to have a technical way to have voting take place. Now, voting can technically take place, so this isn't a problem. But if, for hypothetically, you were unable to construct a system whereby people could vote, then your society would be nonsensical. It couldn't function on its own terms, right? And that's the type of problem I'm talking about. Now, when people question alternate, uh, proposed societies, there's different levels of the validity of their question. So, like, I think that if you're talking about something that absolutely is going to require this, it's directly implied, if not explicitly stated, then that's a fair question. If you're going to have a society that's based on voting, then it's a fair question. Is voting something that you can instigate among everybody? And it is. So, like, that question is easy to answer, but it's necessary to have an answer to that question. You have to be able to say, yes, it can be done, this is how. Um, it's not valid to then say something like, do you know exactly how every single person will vote necessarily on a particular issue? I don't think that's a fair criticism. I don't think you can ask somebody who says they're going to have a society based on voting, do you know how everyone will vote on whatever issue? They don't have to know that prima facie, because the system is about finding out how people will vote, but they don't necessarily have to know what the outcome is going to be every time. Uh, Similar, if we're talking about an anarcho-capitalist society, I think it's fair to ask, well, who, what's the process by which goods and services are going to be provided, and what's going to prevent, X and Y, and Z. But I do think there's also unfair exact questions, like questions that, for instance, here's a common one: how are you going to solve the free rider problem? Well, uh, part of the problem with that is that there's no societies that have solved the free rider problem. We have free riders in state systems right now. And so it's a little bit disingenuous to be like, well, your system's invalid because it's not solving a problem that our current system is actually not solving either. Now, if you want to make a more nuanced, sophisticated question like, will there be more or less free riders than our current system, and will the difference be enough to make to be existentially important to the function of the society? Fine, but that's not how it's phrased most of the time. Another real common one is to ask very, very kind of, well, hypothetically, to create a hypothetical scenario and then to assert how that's going to play out. So I remember Mr. 1001 Nights used to ask, well, what about, it's all well and good, insurance and private contractors and aid societies and charity, all that could happen. He was basically acknowledging that all that would probably exist. But then what about an old lady who nobody knows and no one cares about and who has no agreements with anybody else and doesn't, for whatever reason, can't receive any charity, and let's say she gets injured in some terrible way that could be treated if she had access to healthcare, but she doesn't have access to healthcare. What about her? Well, she's going to die, and it's not going to be good for her. And I don't know of any society that you can't draw a hypothetical scenario where somebody is going to, quote, fall through the cracks and die. And when I hear these egalitarian socialists, and by socialists I'm going to say here, to kind of cut through all the variations, the collective means ownership of the means of production by everyone, basically. And that is rhetorically and practically rhetorically what they almost all go for. It's practically, I think sometimes they hem and haw about this a little bit, but I don't normally make comments on videos against capitalism. I'm way past the stage where I'm interested in comment wars. Very rarely are you communicating with a person very effectively. It's just a shouting match, and you end up throwing insults, and you're not going to convince anybody, and so it's not a worthwhile activity by and large. Are there exceptions? Sure, but every once in a while you'll do it. So this guy had made this anti-anarcho-capitalism video. It was not very good, and I just posted some comments. He said some things that were completely false. He said, for instance, in private property, you can have certain people have infinite property. I mean, I was just like, well, regardless of like socialism, capitalism, that's impossible. No one can have infinite property. And he said a couple other ones. He made maybe it's not fair to point it out, but he said that well, that anarcho-capitalists think that Rothbard has all the answers, despite the fact that he doesn't use the imperial method. And of course, ANCAPs don't think Rothbard has all the answers. At least most ANCAPs don't. And there's no such thing as an imperial method, unless he's talking about using feet instead of meters. And basically, I was just pointing that stuff out. I couldn't resist. It's not necessarily the most valid. Well, saying that people have infinite property, he's like, well, workers can't get ahead because a capitalist could have infinite property, and so they can't escape. Well, who has ever had infinite property? Seems like an impossible scenario. Even if someone did own everything on Earth, that wouldn't be infinite property, but whatever. And in the replies that I got, and I replied maybe 2 or 3 times, and then that's as far as I'm going to go. People were using this very strong rhetoric of like all the people will own all the means of production and all this, and leaving for now the kind of arbitrary distinction between personal use property and private and means of production, and how come these aren't the means of production. And I always wondered, like, where's the line between a private property garden and a means of production farm. And the logical problems with, well, if you can own the product of your own labor, and you can own your own labor, why can't you sell it or rent it or exchange it with somebody else? Like, if you have the right to do one, if one is acceptable and okay, why is the other one, would not that directly apply that? But leaving all that aside, I'm more curious about the practical issues in this all the people own all the capital, because that implies a couple things. Some very specific arrangements that have to be meted out, and then those arrangements all have pretty obvious flaws and detriments to them, and so it's worth like exploring them. And again, the rhetoric doesn't always line up. They say all people, and not all socialists will believe that. They'll think, well, maybe only the people in a certain region. But that kind of goes against the right. So like, if you say all the people, because it's funny, because why should only a few people own like all the factories? And it's like, well, there's nothing in anarcho-capitalism that says that only a few people should own all the factories. There's no like moral imperative for that. But if you're against some small minority controlling a particular factory, and your rhetoric is all the people own it, then that implies that all people, and not just within the country, but all over the entire world, really have a say in the operations of every factory. That's That is the logical implication of that, and that's certainly like where the rhetoric suggests itself, because it wouldn't make sense to be like, we don't want a minority of the population owning the factories, and then say, well, we're only going to have a minority of the workers voting on each factory, because then that's the same thing, right? I mean, you're having a minority of the population as opposed to all the people, which he always wrote in capital letters for emphasis, you know. It's by placing such emphasis on that, it's very hard not to then reach conclusions like, okay, do you want everybody to vote on it? Because there's lots of problems with that. Um, it's practically it would be difficult, but not impossible. Let's assume that the technical issue of being able to vote on an issue is readily solved, and I don't know, you have a clicker system, but here's the thing: for the society of the world, or even if you want to simplify it to the society of a nation, um, that's going to include hundreds. Well, even a small nation would include hundreds, but if we're talking about the world, we're talking about thousands or millions of factories that use the totality of the world's resources, right? Um, and you're talking about every day, each factory needs to make hundreds or thousands or millions of decisions, and you multiply all that out, and you come up with like an insanely huge number of things that every single person has to vote. More, even if you just went like this, with your finger, voting, like that, constantly, all day, every day, you could not even begin to reach even a single percent of the number of things that would need to be voted on, if indeed all people are going to have an equal say on everything, right? If you're going to say, because and like in a certain rhetorical sense, I mean, the availability of even 1 gram of resource on the other side of the planet hypothetically has an effect on everybody. Now it has a higher, more localized effect, like the 1 gram of apple that I ate affects me more than it affects the people who now have to pay a approaching zero measurable increase in the price of apples because I've consumed some of them. But it still, like, theoretically, hypothetically, logically does affect them. Uh, but the thing is, that raises two problems. If you're gonna, well, I mean, if you're gonna say everyone votes on everything, it's just ridiculous. You can go like this, you couldn't actually do it, unless we do oh, they're like, that's an easy thing. All you have to do is like an email and say select all, right? So like vote yes on everything. But then the question is, you're voting without even knowing, not even nominally what you're voting for. You're just voting yay or nay based on nothing. You don't even know what you're following. And if you try to, like, the instant you're like, I'm going to think about this issue, um, you're you're going to fall behind what you should be voting on. Now, people say that's ridiculous. Like, nobody suggests that. Like, well, no. If you say that you're against minorities having increased say or more control, and you say that all the people should control all the means of production, then it's a perfectly valid like question. How are you going to make that work, and why are you going to violate your principles? And if you're going to say that we do have different, oh, it won't be like that. You'll only be voting on the things, and I've heard socialists say this. Well, you should only have a vote that's in proportion to how much it affects you. So, like, the doings of a factory in Sichuan province in China about a product that you don't use, you won't necessarily vote on. But then this goes against the rhetoric, right? This goes against the all people, because then you're saying, no, only certain people, only and it really only, again, tiny minorities in any given factory or in any given industry are going to be able to vote. And then it draws the question of, okay, so we're going to have weighted voting. How much do you weight each vote then, right? If I work in a factory, how much does my vote count relative to people who merely consume the products of that factory, uh, versus people who don't consume the products but live nearby, versus the people who are the suppliers of the raw materials that go into that factory, versus the other people who work in the factory but who have different jobs, or who have worked there longer or less, or care more or less. It becomes its own, like, the idea of weighted voting. It's going to be either retardedly simplistic and arbitrary, and just say, well, if you work there, you get 2 votes and everyone else gets 1, in which case it doesn't really mean anything, right? Or where you draw the line, say, well, this factory, it's not everyone in the whole world, it's only the same people in that region. Well, what region, right? Where are we going to draw, the gerrymandering that's necessary, right? And then your question is, who's drawing these lines, right? Like, it's kind of, you can't just assume, oh, that'll all be figured out. I've asked this to socialists, and they'll be like, oh, well, those lines will all be figured out already. Like, how, who? Like, and whoever is the one drawing these lines de facto has enormous influence on the decision-making process on everything. So it's kind of a big deal. And if we're talking about, whose vote is valid and whose vote is not, and how much they should be weighted, you can't really vote on that, right? So if we have an election, and I say, well, I work in this industry, so I'm entitled to 300% the votes as you, and you say, no, we should have an equal vote, or I should have, or you should have less votes than me. How do we vote on that? And you say, well, we'll have consensus, we'll all agree, and I agree. Like, if you have unanimity, it's not a problem. I just think that that's a very, very unreasonable assumption to have when you're talking about a hypothetical human society where unanimity is actually quite rare. So, in fact, probably never happens if you're talking about the entire world, or even relatively small groups of people. And the problem that I see is whether they qualify this with representative democracy, or direct democracy, or consensus building, or worker-owned factories. All of these imply things that are really problematic. They either end up putting them in a position that violates what they consider just, having some people have more control than others. Some people rising to the level of owners. The whole worker-owned factory thing, that's fine. I don't, anarcho-capitalists are uniform pretty much in their assent that this is okay if people want to do it voluntarily. But within their own ideology, though, it raises all kinds of problems. So you have, let's say you have 10 workers, they get together, they build a factory together. They invest their own money because there's no capitalists, right? We can't have an initial investor. And you can't predicate everything on expropriating this from capitalists, because once you eliminate all the capitalists, there will be no more capitalists to expropriate. So the next new factory, after the revolution happens, the next new factory that has to be built, unless you're assuming no new factories will ever have to be built, 10 workers get together, they're going to build widgets, they all go in it, they all go in equal, they all invest 10% of the total, of whatever savings they have, whatever they made. The full product of their labor has been paid, and the worker owns factories that they worked in before. They go, and they're the investors, and they create this factory, and they all go and they work in it. Now, it depends on the system of socialism you're talking about, but then they're going to get paid back not just their wages, but what they've invested into it. And it wouldn't make any sense then, though, if after they've built this factory, they've risked their own savings and their own hard work, if say they built it themselves and they didn't actually invest money, but they just applied their labor directly. And then 2 or 3 years later, somebody else comes on, says, I want to work here. They hire them, and they say, I have the same say as everybody else, even though I didn't front any of the capital. I didn't put forth my labor to build it in the first place. The idea that this person would have an equal say with everybody else, it's if you're going to say, well, he should anyway because he's still a worker, then that means that there is no reason, there is no incentive for these investors to go and do it in the first place, right? The only reason you would take the risk of investing your time and labor, or your money or your savings, in a venture like this is with the prospect that then you will be able to reap the reward. And if you're told you can't reap the rewards of taking that risk, you still get to take the risk, but you don't get to reap the rewards. Any other workers you have, they get to reap it equally with you, then there is no reason to do it. There is no reason to do it, and it will not be done. And well, my point is all this is not to just raise all these issues, to be like, if you're a socialist and you believe in this system, it should already have occurred to you that these are the problems that are out there, and you should already have solutions to them. Not rhetorical slogans, not just say in all caps, we the people. No, explain how to solve these problems. Because these are not hypothetical problems. These are not, well, in the right circumstances, this might be an issue. This is an issue if you have a system that is like this. You have to be able to resolve this, otherwise the system cannot function it cannot function at least as well as what we have today. It'd be much worse. And would always, and every time I interact with socialists like this, I'll come up with a long list of questions. They're not rhetorical. They're accepting the premises, and they're saying, how are you going to do this? How are you going to weight the voting? If you're not going to weight the voting, how are people going to know what they're voting about if they're voting about everything? How are you going to draw the lines? How are you going to do this? And the thing is, whenever I ask these questions, I don't get answers. And what's astonishing to me is these are usually from people who, it'd be one thing if somebody said, well, I'm not really into this, I just think it's a good idea, but whatever, no big deal. But these are people who are actively going out promoting these ideas as maybe not a job, but as a major hobby. It's something that they really, really believe in. And if that's the case, then they should be able to defend their ideology pretty well. And if they're intelligent at all, these issues should already have occurred to them, right? Because they occurred to me the second you propose a system like this, all of these issues come up. And I'm not saying that these issues make it impossible, but I'm saying you need to have solutions to them. And without, and I'm not saying you have to tell me how they're going to vote. You have to tell me exactly, how many incandescent light bulbs are going to be in your shoe factory. I'm not asking that. I'm asking, how do you decide if you're going to say we the people get to run that? Like, and the other thing is, what do you do if there's disagreement? Like, what if the consumers want one thing and the people who work in the factory want something different? Or what if one factory comes out and says, listen, we really like that you have a shoe factory, it's really nice, but really we make, let's say, cell phones, and cell phones are more important, and so the resources that are going to you, they should be going to us instead. Who votes then? And what about the people who provide the resources or the energy? And if they disagree, I mean, it's just, all this is kind of glossed over, and it's just assumed there's going to be unanimity. Like voting almost becomes superfluous in that scenario, by the way. Like, if there's unanimity, why is there voting? What's the process when the voting, I mean, if you believe in this stuff, you should have thought of all this. I'm an anarcho-capitalist, so if someone asks me, like, how are you going to build the roads? What about medical care? What about gun control? What about nuclear weapons? What about the environment? What about negative externalities? What about the free rider problem? What about the prisoner's dilemma? I have fucking thought about all that, and I have answers that I can give. Now, sometimes these answers are going to be longer and more involved than, or they need to be longer and involved to be convincing. If you're going to put them in like a text bracket in a comment section of a YouTube video, but I have answers, because I wouldn't adopt this philosophy if I could not resolve them on my own, right? If I couldn't, well, that's a problem that. Yeah, and there are like intractable problems, but there are intractable problems with like every system, right? You're never going to have the utopian system, and I'm not holding myself to that standard. But if I can at least explain how functionally this could be done, and even give empirical examples as to why it could be done and theoretical reasons why that would work, then I wouldn't have any business going around making videos and comments, advocating such, a radically different political philosophy. And it's radically different. Like, it's not completely off the wall radically different, but yeah, it would be a major change. And the thing is, I ask all these questions of these socialists, and they should be, so often, I'll be met with, they won't answer the questions. They'll come back with something unrelated. And sometimes I say, well, I don't really know. And I've done this with TVP people quite a few times. I remember one very classic example. This guy was, calling me an idiot, and you're closed-minded, blah, blah, blah. And then I was like, okay, how is the TVPT going to bloop, 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 bloop? And he tried to weasel out of it, and I was like, no, I'm asking these questions, and these are not, like, unfair questions. These are directly implied about the system you're talking about. And he had to throw up his hands and like, I don't really know. And he tagged a whole bunch of people, hey, can you guys help me? And I just ripped that guy a new asshole, because he's spending his time going out there advocating this thing, and he can't even defend it. He can't even explain how it could even work. These aren't like, oh, it would be a problem, or the efficiency would go down 3.2% if you can't answer this question. No, it would not. It cannot work. It cannot function. It can't produce anything if you can't answer these questions. It can't result in anything but total chaos unless you can resolve these issues. Total chaos or total dictatorship. And if you hadn't thought of these issues before, then you're a moron, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with being a moron, but then you shouldn't go around thinking that you're the most enlightened person in the world because you're advocating something that the ramifications for which never even occurred to you in however many years. It's surprising these people will do it for years and years and years, and until they meet the right ANCAP or whoever who's going to point out, like, okay, well, what about the gerrymandering issue, or if you're going to have representative democracy, like, who represents who, and how can one person represent the interests of more than one person, and isn't there an incentive then, like, for them to ignore their constituency and blah blah blah, and isn't that what we have now, and and yeah, it's kind of pathetic, and it's kind of it's a very glossy sort of. I like the idea. It makes me feel good. Again, there's the whole emotionalism versus rationalism kind of uh, dynamic going on here. Where, like, it makes me feel good, and so I'm just going to kind of gloss over all that and advocate it without, really being able to defend it or really explain. Again, and explain in a fair way. Again, I'm not saying you've got to come and tell me, like, how many orange groves there's going to be, but you do need to tell me what the process is going to be when the apple farmers say they need half the acreage the orange growers are using, and how that's going to be resolved and who's going to have to vote on it. And if I didn't touch on it briefly, if you're going to have everybody voting on everything, how can they be even remotely informed voters, right? And why does it even make sense to assume that, right? Like, people don't have, they're not equal. People are not equal in the terms of what they know, what they care about, what they can do, and to then assume, okay, so people who have, or how interested they are in something, so then assume that they should have an equal say. That does not make sense. That does not make sense to have, if you're going to do all the people and all this egalitarian rhetoric, it seems to me very strongly to imply that everybody should be able to vote on everything, right? And so you'd have some workers in a factory, but they should have the same vote as everybody else, including people who not only don't work there, have never been there, have never been close to there, have never used a product from there, don't even know what the product is, don't know a single person involved, don't know any technical aspect about anything involved, doesn't know anything about the resources involved, knows nothing, it would be just the shorthand way to say this, and then say they have the same vote as somebody who, like, knows a lot and has been working there a long time. Does that make any sense at all? No, it does not. It does not make any sense at all. And then if you're going to say, well, no, we'll have the weighted voting, that raises all these other issues, or, well, it won't be everybody voting, just the people who are, directly affected, however that's defined. Like, there's no, potential abuse in a system that, where you have these really Byzantine lines drawn. And I've had people, no, it will be really simple. It's very obvious where all the lines should be drawn. This is clearly from an urbanite who lives in a city and just looks at a map. It's like city, city, city. See that all? And like there's no people who live between them. Like, there's no argument. Like, the people, say, in Manhattan might say, we're our own unit. We shouldn't be voting at the same time with people in the Bronx or Queens or whatever, because those are clearly different, or with different sides of Manhattan, or different blocks on a street. To just say it's kind of obvious to you is not a scientific explanation. It's not a workable solution to the problem, because it could be a totally different, if we're talking about gerrymandering, like, you could look at the map of the United States and say, oh, okay, I know exactly how it should be lined up. And somebody else could look at the same map and, like, I know exactly how it should line up, and it will be different from you. Well, how do you resolve that, right? Are you going to vote on it? And you could just say, no, your vote doesn't count because you don't live in the right district. And the other person say, no, your vote doesn't count because you don't live in the right district. Oh, how are we going to resolve this? By voting? That is not a rhetorical question. That is not a rhetorical question. That is a very specific question. And it could be resolved if you have unanimity and you both say, oh, you know what? Okay, well, with 2 people, you might get that, maybe. With 100 people, you won't get that. With 1,000,000 people, you'll never get that. It's impossible. With the population of the world, we're past the point of this being a rational discussion at that point. So, I mean, this video, I'm not stressing all the problems with socialism so much as the what's fair and what's not fair when you're talking about hypothetical scenarios, hypothetical societies, and not just hypothetical societies, but I almost look at it more as like a reforming kind of trend, like what would make society, better. And if you're gonna advocate for a change, and indeed a radical change, then you should be able to explain, questions that are directly implied by that. And if you can't, it's a huge red flag if like you don't have an answer. And that implies that like it never even occurred to you to come up with a solution, or you can't come up with a solution and you're going to advocate it anyway, which means you don't care about results at all. Like you don't care what actually works and what's actually effective. It's only what makes you feel good, which is of course quite common in politics. You don't have to know if the welfare program really works or not to support it, because it just makes you feel good. And unfortunately, that's like an enormous problem when we're talking about socialism and socialists. And I don't mind if they're like throwing their own like lives away and completely fallacious social experiments that will never work, as long as it's their lives. The problem arises when they want to like take me along with them, down to down to despair and destruction. At that point, it becomes something that I have to take issue with. So anyway, that's going to be it for this video, and I'll talk to you all in a little bit.